Chapter 4 in forensic science is collection of crime scene evidence. I will link the lecture video here on the first slide of the slideshow if you need to find it again, and it will be in Echo. So this chapter covers types of evidence, collection of evidence, the chain of custody, submitting evidence, crime scene safety, and some legal considerations. So here's some types of evidence. So you have drug evidence and DNA evidence. This is the analysis of the blood. And then some collection tools are right there. So Sir Edmond Locard of France, he's considered the father of ridgeology, stated that 12 minutiae is enough to identify a suspect. He came up with the famous Locard's exchange principle, where every contact leaves a trace. And they used this concept to identify counterfeiters by the metallic residues on the suspect's clothing that could be traced to the counterfeit coins. So any kind of divisible matter leads to transfer when there's contact, and then that's forensic evidence that could help solve crimes. So physical evidence is almost anything that's matter. The purpose of recognizing physical evidence is so that it can be collected and analyzed in order to help solve a crime. It is difficult to ascertain the weight given a piece of evidence will have in a case, as ultimately the weight will be decided by a jury. So as you are collecting evidence, it's really hard to tell if that's going to be significant or not at the onset. So be careful with everything. Here are some common types of physical evidence, and it's a long list. Paint, petroleum products, plastic bags, plastic, rubber, and other polymers, powder residues, soil and minerals, tool marks, vehicle lights, wood and other vegetative matter, blood, semen, saliva, documents, drugs, explosives, fibers, fingerprints, firearms and ammunition, glass, hair, impressions, and organs and physiological fluids. So, and that's not the full list, of course. There could be many other things as well. In order to collect this wide variety of physical evidence, you should have a significant amount of tools. Not the least important is what you're going to collect your evidence in. So certain evidence requires paper bags, others require um, airtight cans or glass jars. So it requires all kinds of different tools. Sometimes you may also want to use optical enhancement. So an alternative light source can be useful both at the scene and in the lab. And here's some examples of some specific light sources that can be used. And for example, this is black light used to see biological blood stains, I believe this would be, by spraying it first with a chemical called luminol and then use an alternate light source to be able to see that. Talked a little bit about this when we talked about our photography. It takes a special type of photography to be able to see that light, that glowing dark blue situation. Procedures for collection of evidence. Evidence that is difficult to detect are trace evidence, biological evidence, chemical residues, fingerprint evidence on movable items such as cans and bottles. So you want to collect items that might contain trace evidence for hair, fiber, and DNA. You need to ensure no loss of evidence when processing for delivery to the laboratory. Bits of trace evidence dislocated from items often are found inside evidence bags and boxes. It's also recommended when you are collecting evidence, two things. One is to collect evidence individually in individual packaging or containers. And also, if there is trace evidence on, say, the clothing or whatever you have, uh, package it with the clothing so that you have less chance of damaging it. You want to maintain the integrity of the evidence by preventing contamination by you or other objects, degradation, breakage, evaporation, accidental scratching or bending through improper or careless packaging. And all that can be super important when it comes to figuring out what happened and also the trial. In order to minimize contamination from you, the investigator, you should use latex gloves, disposable forceps so that you don't have any worry about cross contamination, and sanitized equipment to reduce the chance for contamination from other scenes or other uses. Whenever possible, keep evidence in its original condition as found at the crime scene. So, like I said before, do not remove hairs or etc. from clothing. Just package it with the clothing. And don't package different pieces of clothing together if they are from like different parts of the crime scene. You don't want to cross-contaminate your evidence. Oh, see, I keep doing a segue for all the images here. So separate all evidence to prevent cross-contamination. Um, we saw this picture before. I think it might have been Peter. No, Michael Peterson. But the well-prepared evidence collector will arrive at a crime scene with a large assortment of packaging materials and tools ready to encounter any type of situation. So you want to avoid this situation where you have multiple pieces of evidence all in the same container, which is the good thing is it's a cardboard box so that it looks like there might be some blood-stained evidence in here. But yeah, it's all jumbled together, so you don't know, if a piece of evidence was on the shoe or on the piece of clothing, whatever. All right, so there's different packaging that is suggested for or required for different types of evidence. So biological materials should be stored in paper bags or manila envelopes. And you should try to allow blood, semen, etc. to dry before packaging. And this is really to, like this kind of envelope, to reduce any chance of like mold or bacteria growth, and that will totally degrade and ruin the biological material. DNA containing specimens such as blood, saliva, sweat, or skin cells. You want to prevent contamination from yourself by wearing a face mask and use disposable latex gloves and disposable forceps when collecting evidence that may contain DNA. For blood evidence, you may take a sample of whatever the blood is soaked into, or you can also take some sort of a swab or a chip of the blood in order to save it for analysis. Arson investigation is a different situation, and the uh, physical evidence from an arson case should be packaged in an airtight metal or glass container to prevent the loss of accelerant vapors. So you can imagine gasoline or alcohols, those things they evaporate very easily, which is one of the reasons why they're so flammable. But you want to keep all those chemicals in. So you want to make sure you package it in an airtight metal or glass container. Drugs, toxins, and unknown substances should be packaged in either plastic baggies, um, paper bags, or if it's sharp, you should put it in a container that will ensure that you don't get stabbed by the needle. Hair and fibers can be collected in like containers like these glass containers or like pill bottle type containers. Or if you don't have that, you can put them in paper, but there's a special process called a druggist fold for ensuring that any kind of like small evidence doesn't like slip out of the paper. And that process is shown here. You first make 3 folds in a piece of paper and then 3 folds in the other direction like that. And then you put your sample right in the center and then you fold it back up. and that way you won't lose your sample. Fingerprint evidence is super important. There are three main types of fingerprint evidence: latent evidence, which cannot be seen by the naked eye, additional processing is required. And that's in part what you see here, where you have to use some sort of a powder or something to be able to easily view the fingerprint. There are other processes, and we'll learn about those when we learn more about fingerprint evidence. Patent evidence can be seen by the naked eye. So, like if you have, really dirty hands, greasy hands, or whatever, and you touch something and you get a fingerprint on that object that you could see readily with the naked eye, that's patent fingerprints. And then plastic fingerprints are like a 3D fingerprint impression in something. So, something soft where you actually make, a three-dimensional impression in something. So once you've appropriately collected the evidence, whatever method that you are required to use, you really have to keep in mind the chain of custody. So much of the forensic work that we do requires very detailed documentation, like you did in the previous project. So every person who handled or examined the evidence must be accounted for. You have to maintain the integrity of the evidence for court purposes. So you select a container to put the evidence in, mark it for identification. So every package has to be marked as to what's in it. And the openings have to be sealed with evidence tape, and the investigator will sign across the tape. And that way, and every time you break that tape open to check the evidence out, you have to re sign over the tape. The information that needs to be on the evidence is the collector's initials, the location found, date of collection, transfer to another individual lab. So, who did you transfer it to? Which, as you recall, our evidence log, the second part, the bottom page of that, had that information, and where you store it in a secured area. So, where in the secured area did you store it? Besides getting the actual evidence from the crime itself, you want to try to get standard reference samples. Standard reference samples are physical evidence whose origin is known. For example, if you find some dirt, like on the shoe or something, that's actual evidence, you want to take samples of dirt from like the crime scene and from any other location where you think that that dirt might have come from, right? Because the analysts need to compare the crime evidence from the reference to the reference evidence at reference samples. So investigators may need to obtain standard reference samples of paint from a suspected vehicle in an accident, but not from the point of impact, so someplace else, an undamaged part of the car. Victim DNA, they might use blood or buccal swab. A buccal swab is the swab of the inner portion of the cheek. They might get hair from the suspect and the victim. And we'll talk about this further too. Like for the hair, you don't want to just like pull one head hair. You want to get, I forget the number, it's something like 10 or 15 hairs from all around the head or different areas of the body because, just one hair might have an anomaly and then it wouldn't make a good comparison. And lastly, you might need to get substrate controls. So this is the surface materials that are close to the area where physical evidence has been deposited, but not on the same area. So this is used to determine whether the substrate itself might interfere with the test. So if you have like an arson, you get some of the charred surface for analysis, and then you'll go to the same floor, but where it's not charred, get a piece of that material as well. That's the standard reference or the substrate control. So all of these should also be obtained besides just the evidence that you think was involved in the crime. Submitting evidence. Evidence is usually submitted to the laboratory either by personal delivery or by mail shipment. Care must be taken in packaging evidence that will be sent by mail in order to prevent breakage or other accidental destruction during transit to the laboratory. Most laboratories require that an evidence submission form accompany all evidence submitted. Case information provided on this form enables the laboratory analyst to make an intelligent and complete examination of the evidence. In addition, usually on the form, it will indicate what type of analysis you're requesting, although the analyst doesn't have to just do that, the requested testing. They can do additional tests that they think would be helpful for the case. So just to review, up through this time, we've talked about the physical evidence and that it includes all objects related to a crime. And it's really almost any type of matter. You remember that long list of things that could be physical evidence. Many items can be detected only through a crime lab. So sometimes you might want to take samples just in case there's, uh, like for example, clothing. You might not be able to see any blood, but there might be some microscopic blood on a piece of clothing. So you might want to take that and have the crime lab take a look at it. Each piece of evidence must be placed in an appropriate separate container. So those are three very important words: appropriate container and a separate container. The chain of custody must be maintained, reference samples must be collected, and evidence submission forms must be completed. All right, crime scene safety. And this is safety of the investigator or evidence collection person. It is important to protect the evidence collector as well as the evidence, to protect against contracting disease that may be at the crime scene or any other types of harm that the evidence collector might come across. So in order to do this, you want to wear proper PPE, which is personal protective equipment, such as gloves. You want to double up for extra security, respirators, chemical resistant clothing, Tyvek type shoe covers, goggles or face shields. Be alert for sharp objects also. And also there's a whole kind of list of, depending on what kind of crime scene, there's more detailed information in the chapter about what types of protective equipment you might want to consider. And lastly, legal considerations. So illegal search and seizure is the removal of evidence. Removal of evidence must be done in conformity with the Fourth Amendment. So that's not illegal search and seizure, that's legal. So the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizure is the Fourth Amendment quote that pertains here. And as you guys remember, that there's a court case, I'm trying to think of what it was, that actually, reinforced the requirement for a warrant for the search. I think that that case was called MAP versus Ohio, MAPP. So warrantless searches are allowed in situations which include emergency circumstances, like if somebody is hurt, dying, or you think they might be in danger. Need to prevent immediate loss or destruction of evidence. A search within the immediate control of the person when a lawful arrest is made, and consent of the parties involved. So those are some of the cases where you might be able to search without a warrant. And that is the end of chapter 4.